In this episode, UW Lethbridge Biological Sciences professor Dr. Shelley Hoover examines fiat lux, or why honeybees are practically magic. Honeybees can live nearly anywhere on Earth. They increase the amount and nutritive value of our food crops, and they make hive products that can be used from medicine to cosmetics, to cooking, and to making light. In this talk, Dr. Hoover explores the fascinating social structures, behaviors, and communication of honeybees, discussing the current challenges they face and our relationship with them.
And as Jennifer mentioned, my talk today is titled Fiat Lux. So if you don't know, that's actually the university's motto, Fiat Lux. And it means let there be light, but in sort of a commanding way, like Jean-Luc Picard would say, make it so, number one. It's Fiat Lux, let there be light. And I chose that title. I think it's very appropriate for bees for a number of different reasons. So first is sort of the literal meaning of let there be light, right? And for a long, long time in human societies, we didn't have electrical light, but we did have candles made from beeswax. And so that was how we saw in the dark, was through beeswax candles. But it can also mean sort of more metaphorically in terms of enlightenment. What knowledge can we gain from understanding bees? What can we learn from the honeybees? And also light in terms of the things that bees do for us. What hive products and what pollination, what do their activities bring to our lives? And the second part of my talk, the second title, actually comes from something that this man said. If you don't know him, this is Karl von Frisch. He was an Austrian biologist, Austro-German, and he's very famous. He won the Nobel Prize in ethology, which is the study of animal behavior. And more than that, he did it for studying an insect. And you know, winning the Nobel Prize is impressive enough, but if you're an entomologist, like, we just don't win Nobel Prizes. And he won the Nobel Prize for his study of animal perception. And what he's most famous for is, of course, understanding and bringing to the world the waggle dance. So if you're not familiar with the waggle dance, it's what that bee on the far right, the really yellow bee in the center, she's doing the waggle dance. And this is the way that bees communicate the location of something to their nestmates. So she's really excited. She came back to tell her sisters about this great source of pollen that she's found. And you can see that she'll do this run where she's waggling her abdomen and then she'll turn around and do it again. And what Karl von Frisch found was that the direction and length of that waggle part of that dance actually tells the nestmates not only how far away that source of nectar or pollen or a potential hive nest is, but also the direction. So the direction she does that run on tells the direction the bees need to fly to go to that thing. And 1 second of waggling equals about 1 kilometer that the bees have to fly. And so Karl von Frisch, this is a quote from him in the middle. He said, "The bee's life is like a magic well. The more you draw from it, the more it fills with water." And so I don't know which of those, meanings of light and magic he was talking about, but I like to think it sort of applies to all of them. And I hope by the end of my talk, your bee well is a little more full. Okay, so maybe it's just me, but to me, these are basically the same thing, right? They're black and orange, they're fuzzy, they're cute, they're friend-shaped animals, right? There's a couple differences, the kitten has more pokey bits, but these are both the same thing. And so with that in mind, keep this is the way Shelley's brain works. In 1988, November, I remember this very clearly. My parents had a subscription to National Geographic. Don't tell the geography department this is what got me in biology. But this issue of National Geographic came out. And you can see from the cover, this is actually an issue about the honey hunters of Nepal. And so the Gurung ethnic tribe in Nepal, they climb these rickety ladders and they scale it to get honey from some of the Himalayan honeybees. And this particular species of honeybee, Apis dorsata or Apis laboriosa, they nest externally on cliffs. They aren't cavity nesters like the European honeybees. So these people climb up these cliffs, they cut off the comb, and they very carefully lower it down to the other people on the ground. And it's very popular commodity, very prized in these cultures, partially I think because it has hallucinogenic properties, which come from the rhododendron flowers. So I thought this was super cool, but it was actually a double issue. So it was actually about not only the honey hunters of Nepal, but about climbing in the high Himalaya. And so the beekeeper you see there is actually Sir Edmund Hillary. And Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay were, of course, the first people to scale Everest. And Edmund Hillary was a beekeeper. So it was just like everything I ever wanted all at once in one issue of National Geographic. So young Shelley's mind is blown, and I'm like, okay, my path in life is determined. There was a brief interlude where I thought, I need a real job, I'm gonna be a vet. And then I realized, no, that's not for me. And so I decided I'm gonna spend my life trying to understand these little social animals. For those of you who are young and maybe you don't recognize it, that's actually a phone booth that those bees are in. And so, of course, the European honeybee, they nest in little boxes. They don't nest on the side of cliffs, which does make life easier for my students. But I had to fit that whole cliff thing in somehow. So, and I know some of you are here. I see Alvin at the back. There's a number of people in this room who spend their free time also scaling cliffs. It does kind of come full circle because it turns out that limestone is full of invertebrate fossils. Jennifer was just asking me what I teach, which is invertebrate zoology. And so when I'm climbing rocks, I can also get very distracted looking for invertebrate fossils. But it turns out I'm not that weird, and I see a number of you in this audience who I know share similar ways of thinking and similar obsessions to me, and I'm going to argue to you tonight that this is actually really common. So this image you see here is an 8,000-year-old painting in a cave called the Spider Caves, which are near Valencia, Spain. So as early as 8,000 years ago, we know that people were climbing cliffs to get the bees out, right? And so we know it's a European species because they've very carefully drawn this figure climbing a ladder to reach a cavity, and the bees are coming out of the cavity. So they cleverly used this little pocket to sort of mimic the bee's natural cavity. And there's paintings, similar rock art from all over the world. There's some famous ones from Africa as well. And indigenous peoples worldwide use bees. We know people from foraging cultures in Asia, Europe, Africa, Australia, they all consume not only honey, but also the larvae, not just of honeybees, but also of stingless bees. And it turns out this isn't a uniquely human endeavor. Many of our close great ape relatives also feed on this as a food source. And in fact, some of them actually use tools as dippers to get the honey out of honeybee colonies. And so because the last ancestor of the great apes, we believe, was foraging on honey, and because all of the human cultures that are foragers tend to forage on honey when it's available, we've probably been obsessed with honeys, or with honeybees and with other bees as a food source long before we were even people. And this sort of has persisted and permeated into many human cultures. So the symbol you see on the left, that's a glyph of a honeybee from ancient Egypt. And this glyph was actually the symbol not only of royalty, but of Lower Egypt itself. And Egyptians were really the first migratory beekeepers. They kept bees not only for honey, but also for pollination. They recognized the pollination value. And they would actually bring them up and down the Nile on boats to pollinate their crops. And so this was a very important and very revered symbol in ancient Egypt. It was also common in ancient Greece. So that coin there is an ancient Greek coin from the city of Ephesus. And these coins with honeybees on one side and stags on the other are really common. You can still get Greek coins modern coins with honeybees on them today. And there was actually a city called Ephesus in ancient Greece, which is now in Turkey. And this city was famous for its temple of Artemis. And it was actually one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, this temple. And the priests were called the king bee. They're a bit patriarchal, didn't recognize she was a woman because she was laying eggs. Anyway, and the priestesses were called melissae, or honeybees. So this temple was, permeated with imagery of honeybees. And to this particular religion, the honeybee represented sort of healing and transformation and perfection. But honeybees are a symbol that are rich with meaning across different cultures, right? So they've been invariably used to mean those things like they did in ancient Greek culture, but also sometimes they're used to represent power or industriousness or orderliness. But of course, bees also produce honey, so sometimes it's used to represent sweetness or benevolence or light. Now, Napoleon, I would argue, he was the king of branding. He was the ultimate influencer, right? And Napoleon chose the honeybee as his symbol for his reign. It permeated everything Napoleonic, from cutlery to his clothing to his drapery and his carpets. Napoleon was also referred to at the time as the bee, apparently. And when he was exiled, he actually had the bee on the flag. So it has a lot of different meanings to different cultures. In more modern times, we know Manchester, right? It's the honeybee city. When Ariana Grande had her little incident, there was bees everywhere after that. And so they chose that symbol to represent industriousness. It's also closely associated with Utah. Utah is the beehive state, right? For similar reasons. It's like social cohesion and orderliness. Which is kind of interesting that it's chosen in Utah, because honeybees, or the European honeybee, is not native to North America, right? It was brought here on boats in those ancient straw skeps when Europeans first came. Sort of prehistorically, there was a member of the genus here. We have fossil evidence of honeybees or honeybee-like insects from North America, but they went extinct. And so the honeybees were brought here with Europeans. And they have so many uses, honeybees specifically, right? They make hive products that we can eat. We all know about honey. It's obvious, it's right in their name. But we also use them in medicine, in cosmetics, dentistry. One of the first examples we have of the use of wax, of honeybee wax, is from a 6,500-year-old cavity that archaeologists found, and the cavity was filled with wax. But we also use it in all kinds of industrial processes: waterproofing, lubricants, polishes, art, to make metal castings, and even literally to make light, right? So they're extremely useful to us. But they're also fascinating. They have these complex social structures, this tight social cohesion, these ways of communicating using smell and movement and dancing, these very complicated behaviors. And so we've been fascinated by honeybees as long as we have records of what has fascinated people. So this is a species distribution map. So each color represents the distribution of a different species. And so you can see all of the different honeybees. The European honeybees distribution is in red, and the other species of honeybee, their distributions are in those other colors. The light blue one would be Apis cerana, the Asian honeybee, which is the other one that's typically managed. And what I want you to notice from this map is that honeybees are pretty much everywhere, right? They're not in the Arctic, they're not in the Antarctic, parts of Saharan Africa, but basically the map of the European honeybee mirrors the distribution of humans on Earth, because we've really brought them anywhere. They're obviously not in the middle of ocean, they need land, but all of the oceanic islands that are occupied by people, we've brought honeybees to. And the reason that we've done this, beyond simply honey, is that animal pollinators are actually required for us to produce our food. Animal pollinators, especially bees, are required for or enhance the seed set of about 3 out of 4 crop species. And they're very, very good at pollination. So the first thing that you might have noticed about that bee there is that she's super hairy, right? She's even got hair on her eyeballs. And that turns out to be super important, because what that does is provide a place for all that pollen from the plants to stick to. Pollen is the male reproductive part of a plant. They're also kind of electrostatically charged, so the pollen just basically jumps on the bee. And so even if she takes some of that and puts it on her legs or her abdomen or wherever that particular species carries pollen, there's always pollen all around them. And so the next flower they visit, they're going to deposit some of that pollen. So bees are out there in the world basically, just making sex happen for plants. But of course, not all food products that we rely on are pollinated by bees. I don't want to give that impression at all. All of these dull, beige, boring foods, they're not pollinated by bees. Things like wheat and rice and potatoes and seafood, of course. As much as I love sushi, we don't need bees for sushi. But all of these foods, the ones that are either nutritious or delicious, these are the ones that need bees. And I have a garden, so I know where carrots come from. You don't need a bee to make a carrot, but you do need a bee to make the seed that you plant to grow the carrot or the onion. Almonds are an interesting one. About 90% of all the commercial honeybee colonies in the US go to California in February to pollinate almonds. Coffee and chocolate, those are important cash crops where they're grown. They need that economically. That wasn't me. And they have their yields enhanced by the actions of bees. And similarly, I am a biologist. I know the birds and the bees. I know we don't need bees to make cattle, but we do feed cattle forage crops that are pollinated by honeybees. So to make alfalfa seed or sandfoin seed or a number of those forage crops that we feed to livestock, we need bees to pollinate those crops. So a lot of the protein, the fats, the vitamins, the minerals, all of those things that we need to maintain healthy, adequate nutrition, to have active lifestyles, those are coming from bee-pollinated crops. And here in Canada, we're very fortunate that this isn't a big problem for a good portion of our population. Most of our population can actually receive adequate nutrition. But there are big swaths of the world where that's not true, and significant portions of the population don't have adequate nutrition in terms of fats, in terms of proteins, vitamins, and minerals, just to maintain active, healthy lives. And adequate nutrition is directly linked to the cost of food. If prices go up, people can't afford food. And that's linked to yield, right? So as yield decreases, sometimes because there's not enough pollinators, then costs rise and malnutrition can increase. So where are we in Canada with respect to bees? Well, there's about 20,000 species of bees worldwide, and about 900 of those roughly occur in Canada. And about 380 of those 900 species occur in Alberta. Many of them would be familiar, probably most people are familiar with what a bumblebee looks like, right? They're very hairy, they're black and yellow, and that's what we think of when we think of bees, is black and yellow and fuzzy. But not all bees look like that. Some of them are green and shiny, like the one in the bottom corner. That's a very common bee around Lethbridge, especially in the opuntia flowers. Some of them are black, some of them are very tiny, and you wouldn't even notice them. So there's a lot of bees that people don't recognize as bees, and there's a lot of things that mimic bees that people think are bees, like some of the bee flies or the hoverflies, for example. In terms of managed bee species, we have a few different bees that we manage. We have leafcutter bees, we have native leafcutter bee, but the ones that we manage are a species that's introduced from Europe. And they're very important for alfalfa and canola seed pollination. Sometimes they're used in blueberry production as well. We have bumblebees, which are Usually the species that are managed are species that are native to Canada, although not always native to the exact region in which they're being used. And they're used primarily in greenhouses to pollinate things like tomatoes and peppers, cucumbers, for example, and also in field crops, especially blueberries, because blueberries actually flower when it's still pretty cold out, and bumblebees are very good at flying and foraging when it's quite cold. And then, of course, we have the European honeybee, which was also introduced from Europe, and they're a super generalist pollinator. They pollinate basically everything that has a flower. They are very vital to the production of hybrid canola seed. They also pollinate blueberries, tree fruits, other smaller crops like raspberries, pumpkins, haskap, all kinds of things. And then, of course, they also produce hive products. And this is what leafcutter bee, very briefly, what leafcutter bee cultivation looks like in Alberta. So if you've driven around in the fields in southern Alberta and you've seen tents or weird structures in an alfalfa or a canola field, those tents or structures usually contain nesting material for leafcutter bees. And it's usually styrofoam, sometimes it's wood. There's a lot of different combinations of what this can look like in different operations. And leafcutter bees aren't social like a honeybee or a bumblebee. They don't live in family groups. Each female is just laying her own eggs and provisioning her own eggs. And so you can see in the circle there, that's a female leafcutter bee. Very conveniently, they've divided it up so males have green eyes and females have black eyes. So they're really easy to tell apart. But she's doing her job, right? In this case, she's cut a piece of canola petal. But they'll fly back with a piece of petal or leaf to that nesting material inside that shelter, and they'll build a little cocoon out of pieces of leaf. And inside that cocoon, they'll place nectar and pollen, and they'll lay their egg on top of that, and that egg will eat what's been provisioned in that cocoon, and then eventually, ultimately, emerge. And the leafcutter bee producers actually will bring these nest blocks back to the farm, and they can incubate them and have those bees emerge right when they want a crop to be pollinated. This is a local bumblebee. This is Bombus centralis, I think, foraging on a lupin in my garden. So bumblebees are a very common native species. We have a number of species here in Lethbridge. I think the number is close to 20. You can see she's just flying from flower to flower. She's got a little bit of pollen on her legs. She's got her tongue sticking out as she goes between the flowers. So this is a wild bumblebee. But you can also actually just buy bumblebee colonies from bumblebee producers, and they come in what's essentially a file box. So it's really exciting when the mail room calls you and they're like, you have this package that's buzzing. Can you come pick it up? And I'm like, yeah, they're good. So they just have this little door that you can open and close, so they're secure in the mail room. And inside is this nest full of bees, right? And they're a little less organized than a honeybee colony, but they do still have sort of different wax chambers that they put food storage in and different chambers that they rear brood in. You can see the big queen there sitting on eggs. And so in temperate places like Alberta, bumblebee colonies are sort of just a seasonal thing, right? The whole colony doesn't overwinter. Only the mated queens will overwinter, and then they'll found a new colony again in the spring. And then that brings us to the honeybees, of course, which are probably familiar to most people. So we have a honeybee here, and we keep them, or beekeepers keep them in those stacks of boxes called hives. And each stack or each hive contains one honeybee family or colony. So all the individuals in a colony are related. They're all the offspring of the queen. And as the colony population grows and as they need room to store their honey, the beekeeper will just add more boxes on top. And of course, they're famous for producing honey, but they also produce other hive products, wax or pollen, propolis, which they collect it's a tree resin, essentially. Royal jelly is very popular in some parts of the world as well. But I would argue with the honeybees that it's not the value of honey that's really the big economic driver. It's actually their contribution to agricultural production. So the value of honey in 2021 was just under $300 million, and you can contrast that to the value that they bring to crop production, which is about $3 to $7 billion, which I recognize is a wide range. There's a big margin of error there, and that's because it depends entirely on how you value their contribution to commodity canola. This map of Canada shows you how many honeybee colonies are located in each province. So in Canada, we have roughly 800,000 honeybee colonies, and about 40% of those are actually in Alberta, over 300,000. And about 100,000 of those, or a third of all the bees in Alberta, are right here in southern Alberta. And the reason for that, it's really linked to the production of hybrid canola seed. So about roughly 70,000 colonies pollinate hybrid canola seed production fields every year. And this is what it looks like when they're bringing bees to those fields. So every year around the Canada long weekend, plus or minus a week, they'll truck bees into the canola seed fields, and then about a month later they truck them out. So if you're ever driving on Highway 3 at night, at either of those two time periods, there's probably thousands of bees on the roads then. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with canola production, there's really two separate canola crops in Alberta. So there's the commodity crop, which is the crop that we harvest seed from, we squish it, we make oil that we cook with, we make meal. And that's grown on millions of acres across Canada and other parts of the world as well. But here in southern Alberta, on our irrigated acres, we really specialize in the production of the seed that is planted on those millions of acres. And so they take two kinds of canola and they cross them, and that makes the hybrid seed that we then go and plant on commodity fields. And so those commodity fields, they have flowers that can self-pollinate. They can also be wind-pollinated. They also benefit from bees. But that seed canola really needs bees to transfer pollen between those two lines. And so they actually, it's a fairly unique system in terms of pollination because they actually use two bees. They use the honeybees as well as the leafcutter bees to pollinate that crop. And they're really critical to the production of that seed. And I wouldn't be a scientist if I didn't show you some graphs. So this graph shows over the last 100 years the number of honeybee colonies, which is the green line, and the number of beekeepers, which is the red dashed line. And so what we see mirrors what we see basically in agriculture generally, where we see sort of fewer larger farms. So we're seeing fewer larger beekeeping operations. And the largest beekeeping operations in Canada are the ones in southern Alberta, which can have 10 or 20,000 colonies. But we can also pick out a number of interesting things about people from this graph. So this first big spike and then big drop in the 40s, that's actually World War II. We can see it reflected in the number of honeybees in Canada. During World War II, they actually rationed sugar, of course. And so beekeeping suddenly became very popular because people wanted their sugar. And then they also used wax in some of the industrial processes in the war. And then after the war ended and the rationing ended, people were like, oh, geez, beekeeping's really hard. And so they all got out of it. The next thing we can notice is in the 80s. So in the late 80s, a mite actually switched before the 80s, a mite switched from Apis cerana to Apis mellifera, the European honeybee, and then it spread around the world. And in the 80s, that's when it made it to the US. And so we were really worried that this mite was going to make it to Canada. So we closed the border to imports from the US. But of course, that's not going to work. Bees think borders are stupid, right? So it didn't work. We got the mite. Border still closed. But as a result, we do see a drop-off in the number of honeybee colonies and the number of beekeepers at that point. And then more recently, there's a couple things we can observe. One is the invention of the technology for that hybrid canola production. So after sort of the 90s, we start to see an increase in the number of honeybees, especially in southern Alberta because of that crop and the need for pollination. And the money afforded it was sort of reliable for beekeepers and allowed them to expand their operations. And the second thing we see is the most recent, which happened around end of 2019, 2020. Who remembers that period? It's a bit of a blur, right? You guys have probably heard of pandemic puppies. Well, there were also pandemic bees. So a lot of people got into beekeeping during the pandemic. And we saw that increase that was already happening in the number of beekeepers increased more steeply during the pandemic. I get a lot of questions about how are the bees doing? Are they going extinct? What's going on with the bees? And so this graph shows honeybee mortality over about the last 20 years. And we usually in Canada just say winter mortality because that's when most of it happens. And so the top of that graph is red. So that's what beekeepers don't want. They tell us it's economically feasible for them to have 15% mortality in the winter or lower. And you can see that in the last 20 years, we have never, as a nation, actually achieved that level, unfortunately. Individual provinces have, but as a nation, we've never achieved that 15% that we're actually shooting for. But it goes up and down quite a bit, and some of that's regional, and a lot of it's driven by the winter mortality in Alberta, because we have 40% of the bees. And there's a number of different reasons why bees die, and most of these apply not just to honeybees, but also to wild bees, bumblebees, all of the bees. The first is obviously nutrition, right? Nutrition affects all animals, including bees. And so every time we do something that changes the forage available to bees on the landscape, that's going to change their health. So if all of a sudden we start planting, grasses or different crops, we stop planting, say, something that the bees like, then that's going to affect their ability to survive. Queen failure, there's a lot of reports from beekeepers that queens just don't last as long as they used to. And of course, the queen is really the heart of the colony. She's the only individual laying eggs, and without her, the honeybee colony will sort of dwindle and die. Everything we put out in the landscape, bees are exposed to, right? So every time we spray herbicides or fungicides, pesticides, especially the insecticides, obviously those can affect bees. Diseases and parasites. So I showed you that global distribution of the European honeybee. So every time we move honeybees around, we're moving their pathogens around. Management. So for the beekeepers, management is also a big part of keeping honeybees healthy. And the final one is one that we can't control, right? The weather. We don't control the weather, but it affects bee health, both honeybees as well as all of the native bees. So when I give this talk in the US, people laugh when I say this is spring, but I think you guys get it. We're keeping bees beyond their natural range, right? Honeybees aren't native to Canada, and management is key. So in this picture, we can see the beekeeper has shoveled off the hives, they've taken off the insulating cover, and they're feeding them some protein. This would be in the early spring. And they're doing that because they want to stimulate the bees to start rearing brood. And so what that does is if they can get them rearing brood earlier than what the landscape can support, then by the time July comes around and peak flowering happens, that the honeybee colony will be at their peak population. And so they can gather all the nectar from their flowers and take advantage of that nectar flow. If they're still ramping up their colony population at the time, they'll miss all that nectar. They won't store enough to overwinter or for the beekeeper to make a profit. And I mentioned pesticides. So we put a lot of things in the environment, right? Not just insecticides, but also herbicides and fungicides and car exhaust and compounds from tire rubber and insect growth regulators, heavy metals, right? All of these things are out there in the environment. We're exposed to them, but so are bees. And not only that, they go back to their colony, they bring these compounds back, and they're exposed to things that we put in their colony because we're trying to keep them healthy. So we're trying to control the mites, we're trying to control the bacterial diseases. And so all of these combined, even if individually they're not necessarily a problem, when we combine them, they can become a real problem and overwhelm the bees' detoxification systems, even if alone they may not necessarily do so. This is a famous example of this from France about a decade ago, where the beekeepers were reporting that there was this blue honey and red honey and turquoise honey, and they investigated. And it turns out what was going on was there was a biogas company a few kilometers away, and they were processing material from a Mars candy factory. And so the bees saw something sweet and bright and colorful, and they went and foraged on it, and they brought it back to the colonies. And of course, this is a problem for the bees. It's also a problem for the beekeeper, because legally this isn't honey. So bees collect all kinds of things. I've seen them at compost bins. I've seen them at sawdust piles. I had an experiment where I needed an isolated spot to put bees, so I put them at the coal terminal in Tsawwassen in BC, as far away as I could get from everything. What did they do? They packed coal dust into their combs. Okay, so Jennifer mentioned in my group, we study bees. If you haven't got that by now, you're in the wrong room. We study their interactions with one another, with other organisms, including people, and with their environment. And so one of the themes that's been ongoing in my lab for many years is crop pollination. And so how do bees interact with flowers and plants, and how do plants interact with bees? And so because we're in southern Alberta, we're particularly interested in canola. And I'm interested in how much do bees contribute to the yield, especially of commodity canola, because that is a bigger question than seed canola. But also, how do the bees contribute to the production of canola? And how is this relationship influenced by the environmental context in which it's taking, and particularly by changes in climate? So some of you will know the guy in red. That's Ralph Carter, who used to be at the University of Lethbridge. And Ralph and I did a number of different experiments on canola, but I want to talk about one today that was overseen by that disembodied head. And his name is George. And George is now a professor in Greece, where they love honeybees. And what George did was he took 23 different varieties of canola, and he grew it in 2 different greenhouses. One of the greenhouse bays had bees, one of the greenhouse bays didn't have bees. And what we found was that variety didn't matter so much, but just the presence of bees altered how plants allocated their resources physiologically. So we found that in the greenhouse bay that didn't have bees, the plants just kept flowering and flowering and flowering and flowering and flowering. In the greenhouse bay that did have bees, the plants flowered. The flowers were pollinated, they set pod, and they were done. And ultimately, the 2 greenhouses, we didn't see much difference in yield, but how they achieved that yield was different. So the yellow boxes, those are the plants grown with bees, and the blue boxes are the plants grown without bees. And in the first graph, you can see that the number of flowers is much higher when there's no bees present. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because it means the plant has to make more flowers in order to achieve the same yield. The second graph shows root biomass, and you can see again it's lower in the greenhouses with bees. And so what that means is in the greenhouses without bees, the plants had to have more roots to sustain more leaf material and more shoots to sustain more flowers. And the final graph shows us the timing of flower, and again the bees are lower, and what that tells us is the plants with bees were actually finished flowering earlier, which is important. If you're a farmer and you're running up, for example, against a killing frost that's going to kill your plants, you want your harvest done as early as possible, and you want all your plants ripened your seeds ripened at the same time. So we've found not necessarily yield differences in terms of the amount of seed mass produced, but differences in how the plants achieve that and the timing of seed ripening. So plants grow differently when they have bees. This is just a pictorial version of those series of graphs, and you can see that they grow differently. So when the plants had bees pollinating them, more of that yield was coming from the main stem, and the plants didn't have to grow millions of branches to achieve that same yield. And this is Dr. Phyro Zikashu. He's a postdoc in my lab, and he was very happy in January last year. He's from Cameroon, so he was very happy to be in the greenhouse when it was cold outside and growing canola in 32 degrees. And Phyro's looking at the effects of heat and drought, both in isolation and in synergy, to see what effect heat and drought have on this relationship between plants and bees. Because of course, as we all know, last few years, there's been several periods where we get these heat domes in July and we get like 37 degrees. And canola flowers actually die at about 28 to 30 degrees, and they don't even function properly. The flowers become sterile. So this is actually a big problem in canola production. We also studied the bees themselves, right? So at the university, my team maintains over 100 honeybee colonies, some of which are on campus, some of which are off-site. And that bee in the middle that you see there, she's the queen bee. She's really the heart of the colony. She's the mother of all of the bees in the colony. And she's the only one laying eggs. So if she dies, the colony population just sort of dwindles. And you can see the workers around her are forming what we call a retinue. And so they'll sense her with their antennae, pick up pheromones, pass those pheromones around the colony so the whole colony knows, hey, we have our queen, she's here, she's present, mom's good. They'll also feed her, they'll groom her, they take care of her, and all she does is wander around laying eggs. Sometimes you pull out a frame and she doesn't even stop laying eggs, she just keeps going. And so queen bees are very important. But it's very difficult for beekeepers in Alberta to produce and especially to mate queens early in our summers, right? Because it takes time to rear the queens, and especially it takes time to have mature adult drones available for her to mate with. So we import a lot of queens. We imported about 300,000 honeybee queens last year. Primarily, these come from the US, from California and Hawaii. We also get some from the southern hemisphere because it's contra season there. So we can get them from Chile, New Zealand, and Australia, and then a few dribs and drabs come in from Europe. But with importation comes a lot of risks, right? So honeybees, queens are costly. So buying a queen costs you about $50 each, times 300,000. So beekeepers spend a lot of money importing queen bees, but it's also risky, right? Because there's transportation issues. If your shipment gets delayed in customs in Vancouver for 3 days, your bees are dead. You just lost $100,000. It's also risky because borders can be shut down, right? So if a new pest comes to New Zealand, boom, we can't import from bees. And so if we're reliant on imports, that's a risk for Canadian agriculture. And the final risk, as we discovered, was pandemic related, right? Because if there's no planes flying, you can't import bees. They're not going to fly a plane just to bring your bees for you. So during the pandemic, this was a real struggle to get not just queen bees, but also some of the workers from out of country in. So we've been working on this with local beekeepers for a few years. We can mate queen bees in Canada very, very well in sort of June, July, and even into August. And this is a satellite image of the rolling hills area. So you can see those circles, those would be irrigated fields. And those blue dots are apiaries where a beekeeper has brought in bees to pollinate a hybrid seed canola field. And you can see there's a lot of blue dots. So each blue dot represents about 160 to 200 colonies. And so we thought, we're going to put our queen bees right in the middle, and they're going to have lots of bees to mate with, lots of drones. So that's what those yellow dots are. That's where we put the queens we wanted to mate. And so within 5 kilometers, which is easily within the flight distance of a queen, they had 1,500 colonies to produce drones for them to mate with, which works out to close to 500,000 drones for our 100 queens to mate with. So lots of mate availability, really good weather in July. It's not too windy. It's usually long days and sunny weather. So it's a very good mating condition. And we've analyzed some of these queens and found that they actually have very high sperm counts and very high sperm viability. So the queens that we can make here are not only locally adapted to our weather, they're very well mated. And they also haven't had any of those shipping stresses. So we've worked with beekeepers. Bees are not cows, so you can just take a big colony and split it and you have two. But you need to put a queen in those smaller colonies that you're making. And so we worked with a beekeeper. We pulled out some of the frames. We made what are called splits or little colonies, and we put in some queen cells, or that pupating queen who's about to emerge as a virgin to mate. And we did this ourselves, and we also did it with beekeepers. We've done it a few different times. And what we find is that young local queens improve overwintering survival. So when we do it, in this particular year, we had 8% mortality over winter of our little new colonies. The beekeeper had 10%, which sounds bad until you realize that the provincial average that year was 41% loss. So we saw a significant improvement in the survival of these colonies. And so what beekeepers can do, and some of them do this, is you basically make up your losses in advance the year before so that you have these colonies ready to make up for what you are going to lose. Another thing we do is we like to work with natural behaviors in order to manage bees. So we're not trying to force them to do something they don't do. We try to use their natural behavior in ways that are good for them and good for us. And so we've worked with some of these behaviors to improve honeybee health. And some of these are social immunity behaviors. So any collective disease defense behavior that's performed either jointly or towards one another. You can see Trushar there, he's one of our deans. He's doing a social immunity behavior, right? He's wearing a mask to try and prevent the transfer of disease in his community. So we wanted to use this type of idea in honeybee breeding. You can see that bee there on the bottom. She's got Braula, which is a bee louse on her back. She would dearly love for someone to come and groom that off because she can't reach that with any of her 6 legs where it is. So this image is a comb. So honeybees keep they build wax comb, they keep everything in it. They're very orderly. So we can just pull these out of those boxes of the hives. And you see on the outside, that would be capped honey. So they store their food on the outside and the brood in the middle. So we've got capped honey. Then we've got a little ring of pollen, which is their protein source. And all those cells that are covered in wax there in the center, that's capped brood. So those are pupating bees, right? So they're going to emerge soon as worker bees, if all goes well. And bees have a defensive behavior, a social immunity behavior called hygienic behavior. And so that's a mechanism of disease resistance that's behavioral. And what it refers to specifically is identifying, uncapping, and removing any brood in that capped brood area that I showed you that is either dead or diseased. And we can evaluate this by pulling out those frames of capped brood. We'll freeze patches with liquid nitrogen so that the brood inside is dead. We put them back in the colony for 24 hours, and then we pull them out again and record how much of that dead brood that colony has removed. And if it's very hygienic, they will have removed all of that dead brood, and sometimes even the queen has already laid eggs in those cells. If it's non-hygienic, all that dead brood is still just sitting there in the colony, and if it were in fact diseased, it would be infective to other bees in the colony. So the idea was that we wanted to know if we could selectively breed for these social immunity behaviors, and specifically hygienic behavior, using proteomic markers, so proteins that we find in the bee. So the first step was to identify proteins in the bee that correlated with this behavior, either negatively or positively, and we identified 13 of them. And they tend to be things involved in sensing. So for example, one of the proteins is involved in binding odors in the antennae of the bee. So we took a screen of hundreds of colonies across the Western provinces. We identified parents that scored low and high in the hygienic behavior, and we selectively bred from them using instrumental insemination. We bred 3 generations, and then we tested their hygienic behavior, and we challenged them with 2 very different pathogens. One was the Varroa mite, which is a parasitic mite, and the other is a bacterial disease called American foul brood. And so this graph, what it shows us is that we did, in fact, in those 3 generations, using proteomic selection, selectively breed for bees that were more hygienic. So on the left, we have that box is Ben, which is benchmark stock. So this is a stock that we propagated but didn't select. And you can see the mass stock, or the marker-assisted selection stock, had higher levels of hygienic behavior in only 3 generations. So our marker-selected stock, selected based purely on proteins that we found ground up in the worker bees, performed better than our unselected stock. So then we took these bees and we gave them pathogens. We gave them Varroa, the mite, and AFB, which is the bacterial disease. And so in both cases, whether we challenged them with Varroa or we challenged them with this bacterial disease, we saw dramatic increases in the survival of the colonies that were challenged with these diseases. And when we then subsequently went and surveyed over 1,000 colonies across Canada, from sort of Vancouver all the way to Quebec, we found that this hygienic behavior was actually correlated with a wide variety, or negatively correlated with a wide variety of pathogens, not just the 2 we identified, or chalk brood, which the behavior was originally known for, but also gut parasites and viruses, a whole suite of pathogens. And it was positively correlated with productivity measures like honey production and health measures. So does the colony survive? What's the adult population? And this is very important because we don't want this trait, even though it keeps them alive, to come at a cost to their productivity, right? They still have to be able to make honey. I'm very fortunate in my lab that I have a really great team that I work with. So Gemma and Courtney are both here, I think, and they both study how gut parasites affect the behavior and health of honeybees. So you can see one of those parasites there down in that the wriggling image. Dr. Leslie Holmes, she's a postdoc in the lab, and she's been doing a number of different things looking at queen health and different stocks, how they perform in Canada. And she's sort of developing a new technique that we can use to screen queens based on samples of their feces. So in large animals, we can screen, for example, we can get a sample of bear feces and look at their gut microbiome, and we can know what they've been eating, we can know things about their health or any potential stressors. And so Leslie is sort of pioneering this disturbing technique on honeybees. So previously, we would have to destructively sample the queen, and so that's not very helpful because now she's dead. So we don't know that, I mean, it's wonderful she was a great queen, but now she's dead because we sampled her. What this technique allows us to do is sample queens, not only shipments of queens for things like viruses or their gut bacteria, but also follow individual bees throughout their lifespan and use it to sample viruses as they change throughout their lifespan, or how does the gut microbiota, for example, change if we use an antibiotic in the hive. This is an undergraduate student in my lab, Jasenia. And if you find a student like Jasenia who's willing to be stung, you keep her and you bring her back. And so Jasenia's interested in more ecological questions. And so this is sort of a very simplified interaction network map. So on the top, we have all our animal pollinators. On the bottom, we have the plants that they're interacting with. So those dashed lines just mean that pollinator visited that plant. And you can see we've only got 3 plants and 4 pollinators, and it's already kind of getting complicated. And you can imagine that as we add species of plants and we add bees, these can get quite complicated. So I want to show you the simplified version first before I show you the one Jasenia's come up with. So Jasenia's undergraduate thesis is looking at the interaction between plants and bumblebees and honeybees in Lethbridge. And you can see there on the left the interaction network that she has come up with for bumblebees and honeybees and plants in the city of Lethbridge. And at that lovely video there, that's, you can see a honeybee and a bumblebee interacting. So they both love cucurbits, so they both love the squashes. And so we typically see both types of bees using those resources. We also do other contributions to the university. So there was some bees that took up residence in the residence. And so we had to help facilities get these bees out. And I can tell you, it is not like Instagram, right? This was a messy proposition. It took days. It was very sticky, very dirty. And I'm not actually quite sure how to put this on my performance appraisal report, Matt. So I just brought you a jar of honey from the wall. And so I just want to end with some things that you all can do to help, not just for the honeybees, but I would argue these things will help native bee species as well, which are, of course, very important ecologically. So the first thing is obvious: plant bee-friendly, pesticide-free flowers. So sometimes, even if you buy them at a nursery, they'll come with a systemic pesticide already on the seed or injected into them. So look for flowers that bees like and that are pesticide-free, and plant them. And I always suggest planting trees and shrubs, because per square meter of ground, if you plant a flowering tree or a flowering shrub, you're getting a lot more flowers than if you just plant something that's just level on the ground. Weeds are good. I don't know if you guys have ever seen those brochures that tell you, look out for these weeds and take them out of your yard. Well, those always have bees in those pictures, right? And dandelions are one of the most important early wildflowers for bees, not just honeybees. So weeds are good if you can tolerate them and they're not noxious weeds. Maybe consider not being too aggressive about removing them. Please abstain from pesticide use where you can. I know there are certainly valid uses for pesticides, but ideally we're not using them just for cosmetic purposes. And if you have to spray something, don't spray it when the plant is in flower, and certainly don't spray it, in the morning right before the bees all visit. If you're a gardener, look in your yard for those dearth periods. So find out when there's a gap in the flowering and fill that gap with something that's going to flower then. And equally important to flowers for those native bees is to provide nesting habitat, right? Because native bees don't fly very far. They're foraging quite near to where they're going to live. So they need a place to nest. And the best thing to do is just have a part of your yard that you ignore and gets derelict. We have sort of a running joke that the best bumblebee habitat is old abandoned cars, because they love the stuffing in those mattresses. They like old mouse nests. So provide places that you don't disturb, because a lot of these bees actually nest in the ground or in stems and stalks of plants. Encourage your municipality, your county, your city, whatever, to plant habitat that's, fill those roadsides with flowers. Put in something like clover or sweet clover, something that bees will forage on. If you're interested in supporting beekeepers, buy honey from a local producer. We have so many of them in southern Alberta. Another good brand is called Bee Made, which is a Western Canadian cooperative of Western Canadian beekeepers. And finally, just encourage and educate the people you meet about bees. And so last but certainly not least, I want to thank the team that organized this event tonight. I want to thank my family, my daughter's here with me today, and also all my friends who have showed up and for keeping me sane. And I want to especially thank these fruits and vegetables. The lettuce on the left is my technician, Jeff. He's involved in basically everything that we do, and also all of my collaborators and the organizations that fund my research. I'm very grateful to them all. So thank you, and I think we have time for questions.
In this episode, U Lethbridge Dillon School of Business professor Dr. Sydney Shapiro asks, will generative AI change the world?